The very thing the world had feared had indeed come to pass. Deterrence had failed. War had broken out between East and West, the Warsaw Pact and the NATO nations. Huge Soviet-led armoured formations crossed the inner German border into West Germany, supported by formations of aircraft, fixed-wing and rotary. In many cases, these huge armoured juggernauts quickly brushed aside or utterly destroyed a good many of NATO's frontline border units, including several armed with the very best weapons available at the time. Nevertheless, they paid for every yard of ground they gained as NATO forces fought back vehemently, despite being heavily outnumbered. But for many NATO units, the best they could do was simply buy time for their comrades further to the rear to get themselves in a defensive position. But as had of course been expected, the largest Soviet thrust arrived in the area of the Folded Gap, predominantly going up against US Army forces, supported by West German forces of the Bundeswehr. Huge tank battles were taking place up and down the country, as NATO rushed to stem the tide. Every copse of trees, every hill, every small village became a fortress for NATO, requiring a huge effort in men and material for the Warsaw Pact nations to clear every single NATO position. And in several locations, these positions could not be cleared, and the NATO line held. The Soviet Union and their Warsaw Pact allies, predominantly East Germany, could not break the NATO line. There were of course some local breakthroughs, but nothing on a strategic level. The NATO line was bending under pressure, under the huge pressure, but nowhere did it break. In fact, each day that the war continued, the NATO forces only seemed to fight back with more ferocity. Units belonging to the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Division were fighting back with a ferocity unseen anywhere else in the entire NATO line, as they fought desperately to defend their country. One platoon made up of M60 tanks of the 4th Battalion, 69th Armour Regiment were given orders to hold the extreme right of their division's line. A powerful enemy armoured thrust was expected in their area. The platoon's commanding officer, Lieutenant Davyy, moved his tanks forwards, sat just behind a very gently sloping hill, so that from the expected direction of the Soviet attack, only the tops of the tank's turrets may be visible. And as enemy artillery began to rain down near to their positions, the young lieutenant, not long having taken over this platoon, kept in mind all he had learned during his training and kept his small command on the move, never staying still in one place for all too long. And indeed, whilst on one of these moves, his tanks crested the hill and came in sight of the Soviet armour. They immediately began to open fire on these distant Soviet tanks, who were moving from right to left across their front. Fortunately, these M60 tanks were the upgraded M60A3 version, with advanced laser range finding and targeting equipment. The Soviet tanks appeared to be a set of upgraded T-64s, more than a match for the M60A3, but unfortunately for these Soviet tanks, they had been advancing towards a pair of M2 Bradleys defending a village, when Lieutenant Davyy's own vehicles breasted the hill and began to engage, taking them completely by surprise. Having knocked out several Soviet tanks, Lieutenant Davyy ordered his platoon to advance, and the tanks moved forward, down into dead ground. Once again, keeping his platoon on the move, after firing off several shots. Lieutenant Davyy had expected to come under attack from Heinz at any moment, but as of yet, none of those deadly helicopters had appeared. However, cresting yet another gentle slope, a second platoon of Soviet T-64s did show their faces, and once again were already being engaged by a second pair of M2 Bradleys at a different village, on the extreme right flank. And 3 burning wrecks were left littering the field, the ammunition cooking off. Here, Lieutenant Davyy ordered his platoon to hold their position. They were in an ad hoc hold down position here, and could engage enemy forces whilst also presenting themselves as much smaller targets. But before long, the sound of shooting came from the extreme right flank once again. The M2 Bradleys were being engaged by something that Lieutenant Davyy could not see, but he could hear the 25mm cannon of the Bradleys shooting, and upon spotting his comrades, he saw that one of the Bradleys had indeed been knocked out and was engulfed in the flames. He ordered his platoon to stay where it was, as he took his own tank over to have a look and see what he could find to engage. He had tasked his loader with restocking the tank's ready ammunition, and this order he quickly reversed, for he feared he may need the gun at any moment. Having gotten his tank into an overall position, he called the rest of his platoon to his location. The chatter over the radio was that the Soviet forces here were now trying to retreat, and indeed, the T-64 came charging over the near hill, straight towards Lieutenant Davy's tank platoon, who were now blocking the Soviet escape.
Target, cease fire!
Lieutenant Davyy and his men had survived their baptism of fire. An entire company of Soviet armour had been destroyed for the loss of only a single M2 Bradley. The NATO line had been seriously dented, bent out of shape, but it had not broken. It had held, and now would begin the war of attrition.